Good evening and welcome to this year's Kenneth Waltz lecture. My name's Ken Booth. I'm one of the editors of the journal International Relations, which organises the lecture series. The lecture series is sponsored by the publishers Sage, who produce the journal International Relations, and it's sponsored by the DDMI, the David Davis Memorial Institute. And I'd like to thank Amy Appleyard, who is the Sage editor, for her continued support of this lecture series. And I'd like to thank, for the DDMI, Jan Wojcicka, who's just left the room, for his continued support, or for the continued support of the Institute. And in particular, I want to mention the help given by his interns, who have done a great publicity job, filling the room, intriguing posters about the talk, and also lined up to do the vidcasting. In 2008, the journal organised a big international conference to celebrate the work of Kenneth Waltz, who is widely regarded still as being the most influential theorist in the field of international politics. His two main books are probably, well, without doubt in my view, the most cited pieces of work in the history of the discipline. Ken Waltz, then aged 84, was delighted to come, and he had a wonderful time. I read his Man, the State and War just as I was starting as a junior lecturer, and I never imagined that one day I would see him, an international scholar of such repute, prized out of Rummers at 1:30 a.m. complaining that it was still only 10:30. He had a great time. And we started this lecture series in 2010, and it had his full endorsement. Ken was a big supporter of the department, and in 2008 we made him an honorary professor, which pleased him to the end. Sadly, Ken died in 2013, just short of his 89th birthday. The objective of the series was not to critique and or celebrate the work of Waltz himself. The purpose of it was to explore the agenda of international politics that most interested him. So it was more real-world focused in its conception than being theory-heavy in its conception. So the things that interested Waltz were war and peace, balance of power, the great powers, power transitions, alliances, nuclear weapons, of course. And so we tried to bring to ABBA leading scholars on the whole or part of this huge war-focused agenda. This evening, I'm very pleased indeed to be able to welcome Professor Chris Coker from the London School of Economics. Chris covers that agenda. There are very few people that I can imagine who cover the agenda in the depth and the breadth that he does, and also with imagination, with challenges. It's a rare page of Chris Coker's that I read when I don't shake my fist at it. It's intellectually ambitious always. He asks big questions, and if you put all those things together, this is why we are particularly pleased to welcome here to give this year's Waltz lecture. Just to underline my point about the breadth and depth of his knowledge, let me just give you a few of the titles of a few of his more recent books. Future War, Warrior Geeks, How 21st Century Technology is Changing the Way We Fight and Think About War. The Improbable War, China, the United States, and the Logic of Great Power Conflict. Men at War, What Fiction Tells Us About Conflict, and Can War Be Eliminated? The journal was delighted, Chris, that you accepted our invitation, and we look forward very much to your remarks on this supremely important topic. So can I ask you all please to give a warm other welcome to Chris Baker.
Well, Ken, thank you very much, and thank you to the University of Aberystwyth, and particularly to you and your colleagues for the chance to deliver this Kenneth Waltz lecture. As you said in your introductory remarks, I spent a great part of my life looking at war in its many manifestations, but the last 10 years I've spent more and more time looking at the ways in which war is likely to change because of technological changes of a very significant and unusual nature. So think of robots, think of drones, and think of the very real possibility in 10 years' time of autonomous weapon systems which will be able to target not only who but what, and do so on their own cognizance. Now, Kenneth Waltz was one of the classic writers on war, and his book, as you said in your introduction, Man, State and War, has actually survived much later than most. None of my books will be read in 40 or 50 years' time. So what I want to do tonight is talk about the future of war and about the importance of human agency. And as a point of entry, I would like to start with Thucydides. And now, General Mattis, as you know, the Defense Secretary in the United States, was asked a month ago who would he recommend should be read as a person who understands war. And he said, Thucydides. General McMaster said Clausewitz, and I'm very glad about Clausewitz because I happen to have written a book quite recently on Clausewitz. I haven't written a book on Thucydides. Mattis was quite right to say that we should start with Thucydides, who was the first Western military historian and the first person to write on war as a phenomenon. In the Cold War, presidents always started their speeches with references to Thucydides. There were two exceptions that both came from the Bush dynasty. One was George Herbert Bush, who banned any reference to Thucydides from his speeches on the grounds that he couldn't pronounce the name. And George W. Probably had never heard of Thucydides, but that was the product of a misspent education at Yale, which might be attributed, but might not, to an overconsumption of cocaine. But there's a lesson in there for some of you in this audience, but certainly not for me. Now, too late for me, unfortunately. The greatest historian of war was Thucydides, and he called war, in the Greek term, to anthropon, the human thing. And it was the only definition he was willing to give. And when he talked of humanity, of course, as a Greek of his generation, 5th century, he was talking about humanity in the terms that the Greeks understood, the binomial distinctions that were so important in Greek philosophy. So the difference between humans and other animals, because the Greeks didn't understand that we were animals, but you now use the term other animals. The distinction between men and women, very important in Greek culture, and the distinction between Greeks and barbarians. But the one distinction he didn't make, which is the one that is most important for us, is the difference between man and machine, between humanity and technology. And this is a distinction that is becoming increasingly blurred as we see the first signs of what's called the post-human condition. When people write about post-humanity and the post-human condition, which most of you in this audience will experience, is a term which we use to describe the amalgam of human and machine, the way in which both are becoming confronted and conflated. So go and just have a look at that film, Blade Runner, and that will explain what our conditions and what our fears and anxieties are all about. And what science fiction writers have been writing about for 25 years is what is about to come to pass. So if you look at the United States, the Defense Research Projects Agency called DARPA, which has been working since the 1950s on ways to reconfigure war, you will find that DARPA intends to reconfigure war in two respects: by re-engineering soldiers through pharmacology, drugs basically, through neuroscience, brain implants, putting brain implants into soldiers, through molecular biology, which is re-engineering actually the human body, and combining this with something else, which is the second approach to reconfiguring soldiers, which is advanced robotics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. And what they talk about is imbricating humans and machines. And imbricate is a word I had to look at myself in Wikipedia to understand what it actually was. Imbricate means overlapping humans and machines. But actually what's happening is not overlapping at all, it's fusing humans and machines. So that a soldier in a few years' time will be able to access information, not by looking at a screen, as we have to do whenever we want to access information, but actually directly doing it through brain implants, getting the information directly into the brain. So back to Thucydides. Will war continue to remain the human thing? Or will we find ourselves coexisting with machines, and on what terms? Their terms or our terms? And one day may we find that machines are not our tools, but our collaborators. And at what point does that change the future of war? My point of entry into this is Kenneth Waltz, because of his book, Man, State and War, which, unlike most books in international relations, is actually still read all these years later. And what Waltz did was break new ground in looking at why we go to war, why war is the human thing, as Thucydides said 2,000 years ago. He used a language a word which is perhaps unfortunate in many ways, images. He said we should look at war from three different angles or images. Most of us in this audience would say it would have been better to have used levels of analysis, but these images that he was talking about were three: the state, the international system, and human nature. It could actually be argued that he was tapping into what my old supervisor Michael Howard, one of the major military historians of our time, called the Thucydidean coordinates: fear, interest, and honor. And in Waltz's schema, war was made possible by the state as an expression of our predisposition to fear other human beings. The famous security dilemma. We simply don't trust each other enough to live in peace with one another. The second was the state as a political community, which as soon as it comes into being is defending an interest, whatever that interest and however you might define that interest. And the state finally as a unit trying and struggling to survive in an anarchical system which we call international order, international society, international system, which we ourselves have produced. And as Steven Pinker emphasized in a much better book than The Better Angels of Our Nature, a book that came out a few years before called The Blank State, said, in a state of nature, in the anarchical society, all you have to protect you is honor, your reputation. And if you lose your honor and you lose your reputation, you invite attack, which is why the United States responded as it did after being dishonored in public after 9/11. Now, Waltz's thesis is very persuasive, but it's not the focus of my lecture. The focus of my lecture is to look at image 1, which is human nature, the human condition, if you want to call it that. And let's go back to his use of the term images. Now, an image, he wrote, suggests a picture in the mind. But an image, and here I make 2 points, marks a freezing of a particular moment in time. And an image in a photographic paper has a habit of slowly becoming visible over time. And I would suggest that that is exactly the problem with Waltz's understanding of human nature. It's frozen in a particular time, in the time that he wrote his book in the 1950s. And to my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong, he never actually changed that. Even in the last edition of his work that he wrote introduction to in 2001. And secondly, I would suggest that a lot about human nature has come to light since he wrote in the late 1950s. So let's just remember that in 1959, when he wrote his book, he thought that we'd actually nailed down what it meant to be human. Only we could think, only we could play chess or a game of Go, only we could compose music. And we spent the last 60 years discovering that none of these things are true, that computers can fly planes, that computers can beat us at Go, and computers can certainly compose music. Back in 1959, when Waltz was living and writing, he was living in a world in which the parameters of science were very severely constrained. So philosophers of the mind, for example, in 1959, took it for granted that they had nothing to learn from science. All of this changed in 1969, 10 years after Waltz wrote his book, when Daniel Dennett wrote his seminal work, Content and Consciousness, which introduced philosophers to science for the first time. So when we talk about moral judgment or religious belief or creativity or emotion, even philosophers now go back to science. In other words, our understanding of human nature has completely changed in the intervening years. So when my students ask the question, as they frequently do, is war losing its human face? Is war with the robots and the drones and the autonomous machines becoming unhuman or inhuman? I say no, not at all. Our understanding of humanity is changing all the time. And I quote the late Richard Rorty, who wrote, "The Greeks thought that our humanity had an intrinsic nature, but there was nothing unchangeable called a human. Well, we are now beginning to understand that the word human is not an essence but a project. It's a work in progress." And that's actually what the post-human actually means. We continue discovering all the time things about our humanity that we did not understand before. So let's go back to basics. Are we the only human being? Are we the only species on the planet to do war? And I would argue that we are. But before I hear a howl of outrage from this audience saying, what about ants and termites and what about chimpanzees, our nearest cousins? Let me just say we're the only species that does war in the way that we do war. So let's put the ants and the chimpanzees to one side. And back in 1973, a Nobel-winning ethologist called Nicholas Tinbergen wrote an article about behavior, about human behavior. War is human behavior. And he encouraged us to ask 4 questions about any behavior that we identify with ourselves. What are its origins? When did it start? What are its mechanisms? What keeps it going? What makes it flourish? What's its ontogeny, which is just a fancy word for its evolution? How does it change over time? That's where the historians come in. And what's its function, which is a Darwinian concept? What's it in our behavior that enables a war, in this case, to proliferate and do well? So let's start with origins. Now, when Waltz wrote his book in the late 1950s, the great question of the time was, who was right, Hobbes or Rousseau? Had we been in the war business from day one, as Hobbes suggested in his work, The Leviathan, or was Rousseau right to say that war was an invention of culture? It was an invention of agriculture, essentially, the invention of property. And in Waltz's day, the smart money was on Rousseau. Today, the smart money is on Hobbes. And whether you're looking at Steven Pinker or John Gray or Timothy Taylor or various other scientists, most of them will say, actually, the state of nature, as Hobbes described it, is what we've been in since day one. And here's something else, which is even more interesting. We're not the only hominid species to have done war. When Waltz wrote in 1959, he thought that Homo sapiens was the only hominid species. We've now identified 7 other hominid species. And we know that many of them practiced war, including the one before us, Homo erectus, 370,000 years ago, and certainly they were engaged in war. They were producing tools that were weapons. So, what are the origins of war? The origins of war, it seems to me, are quite clear. The war became a need to defend our scarce resources, our food supply, the land, the territory that we needed to defend. Territory, of course, has got more than food supplies identified with it. It's also the home of our ancestors. Very important, because we always go to war for the ancestors. Those ancestral voices prophesying war, as the great poet said. It's a spirited place as well. It's where the gods are located. So, whatever the land may be, we went to war for the land. But we can go a little further than that. Montesquieu, the French philosopher who Clausewitz was so influenced by, also theorized that war began when we could organize ourselves to defend our territory, which is what I've just been saying. But of course, the point is, once you can organize yourself to defend your own territory, you can also organize yourself to invade someone else's territory. Not only to defend your resources, but to go in for resource acquisition. First question that Donald Rumsfeld asked after 9/11, how do we organize the Defense Department for manhunts? Aristotle actually defined war in the Politics. He said it was hunting. It was hunting for possessions and people at the same time. It's a brilliant definition of war. Aristotle has always got there first. And many people see drone strikes as manhunting on a global scale. And it's a profession which these days has its own scientific backing. Social network analysis, nexus topography. These are new sciences. Some people say they're pseudosciences, which enable us to actually map out social environments and find the nodes that keep a social environment together and take out those nodes one by one. Manhunting, if you like. Let's go to the second of Tim Bergen's ideas, mechanisms. In 1917, a 37-year-old English poet, Edward Thomas, was asked why he'd volunteered for war. He hadn't been conscripted, he volunteered for war. Why have you volunteered for war? He reached out, bent down, got some ground, some earth in his hands, and said, for this, for England, for English soil. That's one of the most important mechanisms of war. How you justify the defense of territory. And of course, by 1917, the defense of territory was bound up with two things in Edward Thomas's mind: 19th century romanticism and 19th century nationalism. In other words, the defense of territory had gone ideational. When the Germans were fighting in 1917, they were also fighting for the defense of territory, but they talked about the German race defining its identity from the German soil. Blut und Boden, blood and belonging. When an Englishman like Edward Thomas talked about English soil, he meant not the English race, but England, a land of rain and wind, a land of beech and oak, a land of perpendicular churches, a rural idyll, a pastoral imagined community. That was the big ideological split between Germany and England in 1917. And if that reminds you of anything, it should remind you of Lord of the Rings. And why not? Because Tolkien fought at the Battle of the Somme in 1916 and was traumatized, as were many, by the experience. And for him, when he came to write Lord of the Rings many years later, the hobbits were, of course, the English, and the shires were England, and the orcs were the Germans, and their land was the land of an industrial wasteland. But don't mistake mechanisms for origins. Mechanisms don't produce things, they merely allow things to flourish. So, La Rochefoucauld famously claimed that no one would fall in love if they hadn't read about it. And when I was a student, I was told that romantic love was something that had not existed before the 13th century. And one historian even dated romantic love to the 1st of May, 1274, when the young Dante fell in love with Beatrice. Well, now we know, of course, romantic love is as old as love itself. It's not a social construction. So what is the love of war? Well, the love of war is, I think, introduced very well by Nietzsche, talking about Homer's Iliad. The Greeks, people didn't fight war because they read the Iliad, but they were impressed by the Iliad because it spiritualized away the cruelty. Now those are Nietzsche's words. It spiritualized away the cruelty. It made the cruelty of war, the horror of war, epic and awesome. In the same way that Hollywood spiritualizes away the cruelty of war because of the production values that it produces. And we still read the Iliad. I don't know how many of you in this audience read the Iliad. 8 English translations of the Iliad have appeared in the last 17 years. 8 English translations. So we still continue to read in the Western world the text that is the mechanism that keeps war going, because we find it awesome. We find Achilles awesome. Now fiction is there for a reason, and Aristotle, to mention him again, told us very much why. What fiction does is it produces an ethos. So in other words, it bonds you, it bonds the writer and the audience. Pathos produces an emotional connection between the writer and the audience. And logos, it's the force of your argument. You're moved by the argument. And all this has now been scientifically proven. At Princeton 3 years ago, they found that what actually happens, what Aristotle assumed happens, actually happens. What it means is that the neural connections in your brain change as you are listening to a story. In other words, the storyteller and the audience bond with each other. And that is why we sit by the campsite in the hunter-gatherer societies, listening in the evening to people telling stories. It's the in-group bonding with each other against, of course, an out-group, because there's always an out-group out there. And then we turn to the ontogeny of war, which is just the way in which things change. Edward Thomas was, of course, talking about a nation state. And we go to the concept that anthropologists introduces to heterotropy. Heterotropy is that you take a very basic unit, which is called the tribe, which is the oldest unit of all in human society, and you just complexify it over time until the tribe becomes the nation state. And there is something beyond the nation state, but we don't know what that something yet is. The state has been with us for 5,000 years. So just think of nationalism as just an extended form of tribalism. And there is a difference, however, between a tribe and a nation. That's a very significant difference. The tribe is based on kinship. That is marital relationship to people within a single group. The nation state is based on affinity. That is a relationship with people that you never meet, but you're willing to die for, your fellow citizens. But Benedict Anderson's imagined community. And then we get to functions. And what's the function of war? Well, the function of war is to reproduce itself. And here we come to religion and sacrifice. Very, very important. Rodney Stark, a sociologist of religion, writes that the more demanding a religion is, the more sacrifices that people are willing to make for it. So for those of you who come from the Anglican Church in this audience, of course you'll never make any sacrifices for the Anglican Church because it will never ask you to make any sacrifices. But if you come from other religions, you may well decide to make those sacrifices precisely because it asks them of you and precisely because you think that they should be made. So suicide bombers are a wonderful example of this. They're good for religion and they're good for the group. They're good for the group because they provide role models, and they're good for religion because, as William James famously said in his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, they produce the religious appetites that attract people to religion. One of the religious appetites is sacrifice, martyrdom. Sacrifice is redemptive. So somebody who can find meaning in his own death is important, and someone who can find her meaning in life from your willing to sacrifice yourself is important as well. It doesn't actually matter whether you're a suicide bomber or a kamikaze pilot in 1945. War strikes no moral poses. It's not interested in morality, it's only interested in reproduction. Now, none of this, I think, would have surprised Thucydides had he been alive today, and it wouldn't certainly have surprised Waltz. Waltz certainly was interested in technology, and the point I'm going to make today in this lecture is that Waltz took insufficient attention of technology and our relationship with it in terms of human agency. But of course he took technology very seriously, and certainly with nuclear weapons he thought that they were absolutely essential to keeping the peace. But he didn't, I think, take sufficient understanding of the relationship we have with technology. And it's not man and machine. We are machine and have been from day one. We have been the tools that we've actually produced. There's no either or. That makes us distinctive as a species. So think of what's the second and third images. Think of the state without tools. Could you have a state without writing, without counting, without printing in the 16th century? Could you have a 19th century state without management techniques? Think of Michel Foucault. Could you have an anarchic world system without technology? Could you have our present anarchic world system without late 19th century inventions, the telegraph, the telephone, the radio, which created, as early as 1904, as Halford Mackinder said, a closed political system of worldwide scope? Can you imagine life without tools or technology? And the answer, I would argue, is no. But let's just return to the first image that I'm interested in this lecture today, which is humanity, the human condition, human nature, where he starts. And two of Waltz's critics wrote an article in 2013 taking him to task on two counts. First, for not fully understanding the extent to which our agency is enabled by technology, and secondly, the extent to which our agency is enabled and amplified by our networking with non-human machines, i.e. animals. And that's what I want to talk about. And that particularly challenges Thucydides by noting the distinction between man and beast. So if we go back to the first, we can look perhaps at actor network theory, which is associated with one particular writer, Bruno Latour. Well, I'm a little careful about actor network theory because Bruno Latour now no longer espouses it. But I think what Latour was writing about 15 years ago is still very important, which means how can you imagine the social without technology? Where does the division of labor come from? Which is the basis of human society, the division of labor. It comes from tools and the fact that different people use different tools. Where does the state come from? It comes from intellectual tools, such as writing and counting, which made it possible to put together a state which is just essentially a mega machine. What we have to understand is that we couldn't hammer in a nail without a hammer. We couldn't do bookkeeping without, we couldn't run a company without bookkeeping. Agency, as Latour writes, is what allows, determines, facilitates, and renders possible. In other words, it's social. Because if you look at society, it's a social conversation between people, and our conversation with other people is exactly what enables us to determine, to facilitate, and to render possible. It's called teamwork. And we're used to talking about teamwork with other human beings, but we forget that teamwork is impossible without tools and technology. And also, Latour writes, our conversation with tools and technology has now changed. And it's changed because we've entered a digital age. And think about the digital age, because now, for the first time, these tools that we have are now managing us. The relationship is beginning to change, and to change significantly. So when you go onto Google, you find that the machine is reading our thoughts. It's directing us to what they think, the algorithms, is what we might find interesting. For example, where to take a holiday next week. It's cheering us up by reading our minds. As you know, the algorithms now read our moods to see whether we're happy or unhappy and produce images that will change our moods. And it also helps to filter through the massive information we have, directing us, as Facebook does, to what they think we would find most interesting. So I think this is a Latour way. And in war, if you look at drone pilots, for example, they're managed now by computers. Drone pilots are monitored all the time by computers that look at their moods and their attention span, their brain rhythms, their heart rates, and their eye movements to see whether they're actually maintaining concentration or not. And they can switch drone pilots off and switch drone pilots on according to how the computer actually evaluates the drone pilot. That's the concept of agency. The agency is changing slowly in favor of the machine over the human being. You've been managing machines for so long, we don't take note of the fact that machines are now managing us. And then just take cultural mechanisms, storytelling. I said storytelling was very important. But of course, storytelling is about the image now. We don't read books any longer. We look at the screen. We see what's on there. We are still in the gravitational pull of the Iliad. We're still in the gravitational pull of the Greek myths in this part of the world. So we look at Rise of the Argonauts and the God of War franchise. We fight computer games. 50% of all computer games are war games. The biggest of all is Call of Duty. The World of Warcraft. Some of you may have played this game. Let me just remind you what happened in 2005 when the company introduced a new character called the Winged Serpent. If you were bitten by the Winged Serpent, you got the plague. what were you expected to do? What any of you are expected to do in this audience if you get the plague naturally, that is to be quarantined, so you don't communicate it to other people. But you know, on a computer game, people are just as like people in the real world. You want to die at home, so people went back home to die, where they infected their families and then the community. The plague went so viral that in the end, the organizers of the game had to switch it off. They had to pull the plug, and then they had to reboot the game. But the interesting thing about this particular game is that some characters deliberately got themselves infected by the winged serpent, so that they could go to the enemy and they could infect the enemy. They were suicide bombers, essentially. And that's why the Department of Homeland Security turned up and wanted to question these people, the American players. Why do you want to become a suicide bomber? Because in real life you don't want to do this, but in virtuality you do. In other words, the virtual world is already impinging on the physical world and vice versa. And that is just an example of the mechanisms that keep war going. As long as you play war games, war will continue to be conducted in our societies. In terms of ontogeny, war is continuing to evolve because of upgrades. And that's essentially what we're doing. We're upgrading our performance, human performance. So Google now has internet contact lenses, which are now being used at Fort Benning, by the way, which means that in a few years' time, American soldiers on patrol will no longer have to look into a screen. They will have directed onto their retina of their eyes the information they need when they are questioning somebody to know whether they are a person of interest or not a person of interest. It's extremely useful if you're on patrol. And the Telos suit, and by the way, it was in the newspapers last week. Yes, Iron Man has already arrived. The Iron Man suit is already here and is about to be used by the military. So we're still, well, I would argue, locked into a cognitive world, a cognitive arms race, in which we are prisoners of our own ingenuity. We're always trying to go one step ahead of the enemy, whoever the enemy may be. And that is why war will continue almost indefinitely while we are in this cognitive arms race. And finally, the function of war. War taps into what makes us human and exploits what makes us human. And one of the things that makes us human is we're mimetic. We copy each other. That's what makes us human. Chimpanzees copy each other as well. So the higher primates also learn from copying one another's behavior. But we really copy each other. We want to emerge from the crowd, but the only way in which we can emerge from the crowd is becoming part of it. We want to copy others and live stream to others everything we do. People who commit suicide like to live stream their suicides to others. People who commit rapes live stream their rapes to others. We have this constant need to copy and be copied by other people. Terrorists these days gain status and reputation by gaining likes and getting retweeted. That is the Darwinian impetus that keeps war going, our need to copy and be seen to be copying. So, let me go on now to a second criticism of Waltz, which is networking with non-human animals. Now, back in 1959, what Waltz didn't understand is what we now understand, is that animals can reason, they have a consciousness, they have an emotional life, and they can manipulate us as successfully as we manipulate them. It's called domestication. So when we domesticate an animal like a horse or a dog, those dogs and those horses are manipulating us as well. It's called comparative psychology. Comparative psychology. We're now working on the psychology of animals as well, other animals I should say, as well as the psychology of ourselves. And it began with the publication of a book by Donald Griffin called The Question of Animal Awareness in 1976. The network with other animals. What did that make possible? Well, that made possible the destruction of the great mammals on the planet, which we engaged in, except for Africa, until the late 19th century, thanks to harnessing dogs. Dogs and human beings successfully destroyed the great, huge mammal land animals in this period. We couldn't have done it without dogs, and dogs certainly would have had no interest in doing it without us. Two species in war, horses and humans. Just imagine war without horses. The great paradox, of course, is that we tamed an animal that fled from us when we tried to domesticate it, to an animal that was willing to charge other human beings in cavalry charges and became an offensive animal. Introduced something called speed into war. Without speed, we wouldn't have had colonization, and we wouldn't have had empire building. We couldn't have done either without horses and our ability to utilize them. And by the way, if you think that horses went out of business when we invented the combustion engine, think again. When Germany invaded Russia in 1941, the German army had more horses than Napoleon had when he invaded Russia in 1812. In fact, the Germans utilized 2.7 million horses in World War II. 2.7 million. 3/4 of whom died. So the death rate of horses is infinitely higher than the death rate of human beings. Now, yes, you're quite right to say, would be right to say, horses have gone from war. But other animals are coming into perspective here, just metaphorically, and one of them are insects. And DARPA, as I've mentioned before, is planning to produce small, agile drones that mimic insect behavior. And that's the future of drones. Small, swarming, and swarm robotics is now very popular in various countries. A complexity that can arise from very simple behavior displayed in a group and autonomous units, because these will be autonomous insect drones that can be networked into a self-organizing system. And so to my last question, which is, Waltz gave us 3 images of war, but there's a 4th image coming along, and it's called artificial intelligence. When Waltz was talking about war and the causation of war, why societies and people go to war, he thought in 3 terms. Now we have a possibility that we will have autonomous machines that will take us to war. We won't take ourselves to war, they will take us to war. That's a 4th image. In 2000, the computer scientist Bill Joy, the founder of Sun Microsystems, wrote an article for Wired magazine called "Why the Future Doesn't Need Us." And I would raise the question, if we still need war, does war still need us? Now, artificial intelligence will certainly increase our agency, which is why we have it. The whole of human history is about increasing our agency, our scope, our power, and artificial intelligence will do this. But it raises 2 questions about decision making, which have never been raised before. The first is, how soon will machines become our collaborators, not our servants? So when will we have to talk to them about the decisions we take and agree on the decisions that we make? And the second, of course, is at what point will the machines take their own decisions and cut us out of the equation altogether? The Skynet possibility, the Terminator possibility. Now, we all know that artificial intelligence is transforming our lives. It helps companies optimize their tax strategies. Last year, a company in Hong Kong put an algorithm on its main board. We also know that machine intelligence will increase exponentially, but we don't know how far or how fast. And of course, and this is the big question, we don't know when the machines will gain self-consciousness, if that is possible at all. But if you've been watching Westworld, you might be a little disturbed. The producers of the program acknowledged their debt to a book that came out called The Origins of Consciousness by Julian Jaynes a few years back, in which he said this, and this is the origin of the security dilemma, of the Hobbesian trap, of the reason for war, distrust. When we got consciousness, Julian Jaynes suggests in his book, we began to recognize that some of our thoughts should not be shared with others. And the moment you realize that you have thoughts that you don't want to share with others is the moment we're in the war business. Okay, for the moment, the debate about autonomous systems, autonomous drones, the killer robots that the International Red Cross talks about so much, is all about when do you subcontract decision making to a machine, and you allow that machine to take decisions on your behalf, because you're the guy who's programming the machine, and you obviously have the idea of what it wants to achieve. And this is the big debate about artificial intelligence. The roboticists argue that it will enhance our agency, which is what we've been trying to do since day one on the planet. But in this case, it will be particular. It will give us a moral upgrade. A moral upgrade. No weapon system has given us a moral upgrade before. The idea is that robots that can take their own decisions will actually be the best thing that's happened in war. And why? Because we are the weakest link in the entire command chain. We're the people with Stone Age brains, the same brains we had 300,000 years ago. Nothing has changed in that respect. We're the people who are given to cognitive dissonance. We're the people who are given to confirmation bias. We have all these problems that social psychologists have written about at length. And we're also handicapped by bloodlust and the wish to kill. Our robots will have none of these things. So that's the good news. The bad news is that robots, of course, may suffer from mechanical failure, which roboticists very rarely refer to, but robots may also at some point decide to have their own ideas of what they think is right or wrong. So it's a big question, which Kenneth Waltz never raised in his work. And there's no criticism of him, because it's only a question we've raised in the last 10 years, or even less. Will the machine save us or kill us? And to use the language of Brexit, are we in for a hard singularity or a soft singularity? Singularity, by the way, for those of you who don't know it, is the term that Ray Kurzweil uses for the term, for the day when the machines think for themselves. Well, I'm going to give you, and I end on this note, two possibilities. I think it depends on the long term and the short term. In the long term, I'm pretty optimistic, and in the short term, I'm pretty pessimistic. What's the long term? Well, I would advise you to look at a book by the popular scientist Paul Davies. It's called The Eerie Silence. And it's about where are the aliens? If they are much more intelligent than ourselves, and they've been around thousands, if not millions of years before us, where are they? Why haven't we come across them? And this is what Paul Davies says in his book. Well, obviously, space travel is impossible for biological life forms. The distances are too great. Radiation or other perils are just too severe. Of course, biological life forms will do what we will have to do as a biological life form if we want to investigate space: subcontract the robots, because robots can do space travel. But the point is, the robots will grow in intelligence over the centuries as they're coursing through space. And the robots will ultimately prefer to explore their own inner intellectual landscapes than the boring business of discovering the physical spaces that biological life forms find so attractive. So interplanetary travel will allow them to do precisely that. So where are the aliens? Well, where the robots are. And where are the robots? They're parked in the deepest recesses of space, working on even more sophisticated mathematical theorems, which is what they find really exciting. So, that's one possibility. The killer robots may one day decide to take us out of the war business on the grounds, but they have no interest in it at all. That's what biological life forms do, not robots. But that's the good news, but it's a long way off. The bad news, the short term, is the robots will do what they observe us doing. Now, we're already programming robots to lie. I mean, who wants, if you're a soldier and you've just had your 2 legs blown off, who wants to be told by a nurse bot, a robot, that you have a 0.1% of making it back to the field hospital alive? So nurse bots are now being programmed to lie, to say, hold in there, you have a very good chance of making it back, or just get you to the field hospital on time. Which is what we do in these circumstances. We lie to other people. It's a human thing, and it's a great thing to do. Lying is not bad in these circumstances. It's the right thing to do. Last month, Facebook, to its amazement, discovered that an algorithm was lying to its clients and customers because it observed people lying to each other and thought this was the normal thing to do. So the worst prospect, the grimmest prospect, I would argue, is where the algorithms will assume that war is normal. In this case, that war is what we do. And Thucydides was absolutely right. War is the human thing, and will remain so for some time yet. And on that note, I will end.
Right, we have a good bit of time for questions and discussion, and the scope goes from pre-humans to post-humans, so there should be a lot. Yeah? You.
Sorry, sorry, I'm very going back on the point about like games and stuff, and kind of if you continue to play war games, kind of like what about kind of like narratives like Metal Gear Solid, which kind of explores deterrence, or that kind of by extension kind of
Sorry, I didn't get your last point. The example you mentioned.
oh,
the last one. Like kind of like Metal Gear Solid kind of has a deterrence narrative. Mm-hmm.
Like kind of like if will that kind of will kind of like if that somehow becomes involved somehow in the games industry, will that therefore kind of end war? Will that kind of like continue like?
Well, I think the problem with games is the first suicide bomber for ISIS, British suicide bomber for ISIS, 2009 in Baghdad, left a message to his family. I've been playing Call of Duty, and now I want to do the real thing, which is why he went off. one of the exceptionally attractive things from ISIS was using social media, but also using games. So Grand Auto Theft 5 was a game that they used to help 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds with the lights out. The parents had gone to bed. They thought that they'd gone to bed. They were playing a jihad online as a 9-year-old and 10-year-old, and then they were going to grow up to the point where they could actually make the decision to go off to Syria, Iraq, or wherever, and play the real thing themselves. And this, I think, is the way in which this is a mechanism, as Tim Bergen would say. It's a way in which we're still in the war business. People are playing it at home. Now, the great majority of people who play Call of Duty, 99%, never want to do it for real. But 1% do want to do it for real. And so they're rehearsing it beforehand. And that is mimicry, which is a very important thing that I mentioned before. But we can take it a little further to a very bad film that came out in 2013 called Ender's Game, which is based on quite a so-so novel. I won't say it was great, in 1985, called Ender's Game, which has been on the syllabus of the Marine Corps University at Quantico for the last 20 years, which is about a child, Ender Wiggins, who fights what he thinks is a game in a battle room, essentially, and realizes at the end of the day that it's not a game, it's for real, and he's just destroyed an entire species and their entire planet. And that idea of children being used to fight war is something which is increasingly attractive to the military. So they go to Nevada, they'll now find 11-year-olds who are doing hacking into other people's computers. If you don't have a criminal record by the age of 11, you're nothing. These guys, of course, they're not criminals in the sense that they are hacking into people's computers to get money or to destroy their reputation. They're hacking into computers because it's a status anxiety thing. They're showing their status to their friends. We can actually do it, which is why the military are interested in them. They have the skills which they will want at some later point in time. And so I think this is a very important point about mechanisms. Games actually give you now the motor skills and the intellectual skills to do the kind of wars that are now being played on cyber space, and to a certain extent also drone pilot skills. And so we're recruiting younger and younger now because they have the motor skills that, say, a 25-year-old has lost by the time he or she gets to 25. And that, I think, is in itself quite interesting. I'm not sure that was your question. You looked to me as though it wasn't your question, and I completely ignored it.
That wasn't really my question.
No, but my answer was so long that you've probably forgotten what your question was. And so that makes both of us happy in this respect, hopefully. Yeah.
If there was to be a finite limit on technological advances in artificial intelligence, how then would that affect your predictions of what war will be in the future?
What do you think an artificial end to technology would be?
I would suppose it to be that since we live in a finite universe, therefore it might be argued technology must by its very nature have an end point beyond which no further improvement could exist.
Yes, that's a very serious question. I'm having difficulty getting my mind around that. At the moment, in my limited intelligence, I can't actually see a finite end to technology, but you might well be right. In which case, please communicate it on an email to me.
To what extent do you believe robots will impact policymaking if the day comes where they actually are collaborators? Are we potentially going to see robots holding public office, holding foreign affairs positions like diplomats, things of that nature? Is that part of the potential?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, and one of the points that is often made is that robots will do the jus in bello. They'll actually do the fighting, but they won't actually be taking the decision making when to go to war and when not to go to war. And I think that's where your question is stemming from. And of course robots can decide when to go to war and when not to go to war. After all, there's a famous film, Dr. Strangelove, which is all about the doomsday machine, which is to allow robots to actually take this decision because of human fallibility. We can do it in probability analysis. So you can have two robots that are actually in conversation with each other, talking about the probability of conflict. The reason we don't do probability analysis, as people like Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prizing economists say, is that we don't do this computering. What we do is storytelling. So we tell ourselves stories about whether we're likely to find ourselves at war with someone else, or whether somebody else is likely to be on the cusp of attacking us. But there's a good story by Isaac Asimov, the man who introduced the 3 laws of robotics, etc. It's very important, called The Inevitable Conflict. And that's a very interesting story. It's about a world in which the world has decided the only people who can run the economy are robots. And so the robots run the economy. And then they notice there are a few glitches, just not depressions and not recessions, but a few inflationary spirals and things of this kind. So you need to patch up the glitches, and human beings have to do that. And then someone stumbles upon what's actually happening. The robots have actually achieved self-consciousness, so they are totally in control. But they know that the human beings can switch them off if they think that they're surplus to requirement. And so they have to create these glitches so human beings feel that they're actually needed. Wow. And that, I think, is a possibility for the self-conscious robots. They will want us to feel needed.
Yeah.
In terms of artificial intelligence and the singularity, like what is needed to occur for, like an artificial intelligence to be deemed sort of self-initiating and self-actualizing, to be sentient in that sense? Like there's a leap that needs to be made between an algorithmic process, which is something which only acts upon human initiation, and something which is self-actualizing. And at least as far as I'm aware, there isn't an artificial intelligence in the world that yet meets that criteria. So is there a consensus on how close we are to, or whether it's even possible for an artificial intelligence to be self-initiating in that sense and to be sentient?
Well, Kurzweil, who, by the way, singularity was a term actually invented by a mathematician called von Neumann back in the 1940s and early 50s, but it's identified with Ray Kurzweil, who now runs the Singularity University, which used to be the old Google University in the United States. There are scientists who believe that it's impossible for machines ever to have self-consciousness, but let's put that to one side. Kurzweil has brought the date forward from 2042 to 2039 and argues at that point they're likely to become self-conscious. But the big problem is we don't know what consciousness is. We don't even know what our own consciousness is. So you can go with whoever you like. I rather like an idea which has been propagated recently, that self-consciousness is just the processing of information. At some point, the information becomes conscious of itself. So it's basically an emergent property. And so just as we talk about fields and forces, no longer particles, but the way in which they act in fields and forces, how they interact with each other, and how that produces behavior, which we haven't seen before. So we're talking, for example, about atoms in terms of freezing or in terms of boiling. The atoms don't themselves change. What happens is their interaction changes their behavior, and it freezes something or it boils something, so you go from heat to cold, or vice versa. And that is one theory of what consciousness actually is. At some point in time, our neurons, in terms of emergent properties, suddenly became aware of themselves. But that's only one theory, and it's by no means accepted by many other scientists. And I'm not a scientist, so I have a clue as to which of these ideas or theories is. But it seems to me an attractive one, because we're talking about emergent properties in the last 20, 5 years or 30 years more and more. It seems to me to be a likely explanation. So when do the machines get this emergent property? When do they become conscious of their own processing of information? I don't know.
I mean, one could argue that, at least from how we can observe, it's an idiosyncrasy of the way in which the human neural process just becomes complex enough to the point where we have this thing we call consciousness. And so as far as we know, it's just an emergent property of the particular way in which our brain became more and more complex. So by that sort of line of reasoning, there's no necessary reason to assume that the technology could become conscious in a comparable sense.
Absolutely. But the point then, of course, is also that our consciousness is to a very large extent determined by our biology as well. And one of the points that Steven Pinker makes is that there is no reason to think that a conscious, self-conscious machine system or silicon-based system will become paranoid or will become psychopathic, because these are largely determined by biological processes, and therefore they may be all loving and Buddhist, and basically we're all going to be in a happier position. But that's not obviously the kind of Stephen Hawking view and others who say we need to wake up now and make sure that that day never actually arises. I mean, the other thing is that we wouldn't recognize the consciousness. And that's the whole point about the story I've just told you by Asimov, that we wouldn't recognize them when they became conscious.
Inorganic.
Oh, no, precisely. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I've got a question about, you spoke about the moral upgrade or the moral improvement with policy. So you can imagine a scenario where you've got more technologically advanced nations that are working either with or for these robots. And so you're presenting it to your population as we're going in there. The robots are doing this, they're morally making these decisions, they're killing the bad guys, but they're protecting others. So can you envision, I'm thinking of every military thing through history, they've always needed to do something underhand. We've always needed to present this as the outcome, but what we really need to do is we could really do with getting rid of these people as well. So I was wondering whether you end up, do you see a scenario where you could end up with a sort of technological kind of presentation to your public and your military and your system as this, the robots are doing a good deed, and then but once they've cleared this area, then we're actually have to be in cahoots with these local guys on the ground who are they've just got AK-47s, and we don't. What we need them to be together. The robots leave, and then you kind of move in your proxy kind of insurgents or wherever they are that actually perform some of the acts that you can't be seen to be once you've engaged with the robots as a moral force. So so you've actually have to create a two-tier system where there's a rise of these kind of proxy armies that are being used by more technologically advanced states.
I think our soldiers in the future will be coexisting with these systems, and probably quite happily, because we're all very anthropomorphic, aren't we? And we love to identify technology as something that is very peculiar to ourselves. It's very interesting, for example, that groups that are involved in exploding bombs or IEDs like to go back after the robot has actually been blown apart by these devices and collect them up in the hope that they'll be reassembled. So we have this anthropomorphic need to think that we can actually save the machinery concerned. This actually comes from our bonding with animals, by the way. It's extremely important that we've been bonding with animals for a very, very long time. And basically robots are just animals as far as we're concerned, but they just happen to be a kind of inanimate silicon version. So I wasn't quite sure where you were going with this.
I was just trying to establish whether politically, it would become expedient to have deniable
deniability.
Human boots on the ground who can do things that are morally superior or morally engaged.
Well,
what force can't do.
Okay, you're quite right. There are two possible paths to all of this. One is complete deniability by just saying that we subcontract and that's it. Nothing to do with us. They're just fighting these wars. And the other, of course, is to say they were coexisting with them. We have to take some responsibility for what happens. Well, my favorite example of the first is that wonderful book by Douglas Adams called Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. I didn't know if you'd ever read it. But so in the 23rd century, there's a robot for everything. Everybody subtracts everything to robots. And there's one, you can actually subcontract belief in God to a robot. It's called an electric monk, if you can afford it. And it will believe in God for you. Why should you bother to believe in God if that will do it? And there's an even better, there's a deluxe version for those who can really afford it, which is to believe in things they won't even believe in Salt Lake City. Anyway, one has to be careful. If you tell that story in the Defense Department of the United States, it's not going to get you re-invited because 10% of people in the Defense Department are Mormons. But anyway, putting that to one side, the other is responsibility. We take responsibility. I think this is what you're saying. And that's the serious point about your question, responsibility. But you know, we don't take responsibility. It's called a responsibility gap. The responsibility gap is that we allow machines to reprogram themselves independent of what we can actually anticipate what they're going to do on the grounds that that's sufficiency. So what is the responsibility gap? Responsibility gap is lifts, elevators, that now reprogram themselves according to the amount of human traffic. So we assume that between 10 and 11 o'clock on a Monday morning, there'll be a lot of human traffic. But the lifts discover, simply by observing human traffic, that actually there's not that much between 10 and 11, it's between 11 and 12. So they reprogram their own availability. It's called a responsibility gap. It's a necessary gap for robotics. Because the only way you can do robotics seriously is bottom up, not top down. If we try to engineer and be the intelligent designer, essentially, for robots, they're not going to go anywhere. If we allow them to do what children do, which is to learn by basically going through or navigating through our world, they will be able to reprogram themselves and become more efficient. That has to be the future of robotics. There's no point having robotics otherwise. We have to take that leap of faith. We're already beginning to take it. We haven't quite got there in war yet with allowing them to take decisions on life and death. That's about 10, 15 years ahead. We may have to go down that road if we're serious about it. And I think that's what you're basically getting at here. And that's coexisting. Because the robots can help us in terms of some of our problems that we have. And we can help them navigate through our human world. If that's a world you don't want to live in, then you have to stop it now. Except it's not going to happen, because it never has and never will. Otherwise, you're going to have to try to live with this world and adjust to it as best you possibly can. And there was a piece in the BBC yesterday. There was a pacifist AI guy who said, why I'm against the Stop Killer Robots campaign as a pacifist and as an AI guy, because we can't stop anything. We never have and we never will. But we can turn the AI to our advantage and get the AI to work for us or with us, rather than try to go through that. So I thought that was a very interesting. I didn't find his article particularly convincing, I have to say, but I thought it was an interesting take, because it's a kind of fight back by the AI community to banning is not going to work. It never has with a single system. So start thinking of alternatives if you're really frightened of AI. And I think this is what the community, AI community, have they got some good ideas? Engage them and come up with those good ideas.
We've time for a couple more questions, so if you want to ask a question, put your hand up now. How many have we got? Wow. We'll take them in threes. Please try and make them as short as possible. And you too. Okay, we'll go around that way. 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. You mentioned timelines on several occasions, so I just wanted to ask you about the practical implications. So a book I believe you reviewed called Ghost Fleet showed how global supply chains, either through economic competition or through sabotage, can compromise the development of these technologies. In light of that, and then in the kind of practical reality where you see F-35 struggling to operationalize because of data security and setting up the infrastructure to support it, how do you see those kind of circumstances affecting these timelines in that development?
Second one.
How do you feel about the idea that instead of having machines on the ground in warfare, that will simply be moved to more of a digital preference, that will have two algorithms battling against each other rather than having, say, a drone-controlled tank doing the work that a human would usually do?
Yeah, can you give me an example of that?
An example would be simply just having two robots try and crash each other's, say, in this state's economy in order to try and create a victory.
Yeah.
Against the wall.
Yeah, can you recommend any female writers or feminist voices in this conversation?
Sorry.
Feminists. Are there any feminists or female writers that you can recommend we read?
Yeah.
Right. First three.
First three, right. Evolutionary algorithms, I think, I suppose we're talking about. So if you can actually put evolutionary algorithms into viruses, in this case evolutionary viruses, into a system, they will obviously mutate in ways that you can't possibly anticipate, may not want to anticipate. And they will also be passive, like viruses. They can be, they're incubating essentially, and then they will go positive at a particular rate. So I think that may well be the future of conflict. You said that I did review that book, Ghost Fleet. This was a book written by Peter Singer and August Cole about the possibility of a war between the United States and China. But there was a war game by the Defense Department of the United States in 2013 about naval conflict between the United States and China. And what was interesting was the Americans discovered on day one of the conflict that the Chinese had put viruses into the computer systems of their aircraft carriers so that they could no longer direct aircraft off the carriers by computer. They had to do it by hand. And basically, one guy stands out there calling each plane off the carrier. Exactly what happened at Midway in 1942. It's not great if you're fighting a war with China. I think your question about robots, yes. There's a wonderful book by Leo Frankowski called A Boy and His Tank. It's about a 25th century tank, which is much more loyal than the tank driver is the boy. And as the sergeant major says to him, if your tank is loyal, you don't need to be loyal. So basically, the algorithms are on side. It doesn't care. Nobody cares whether you're on side or not. Yes, well, I've forgotten what your question was now, but I did write down The Cool War. And The Cool War is a book by actually a science fiction work in 1948 about, and it's also been adopted by Noel Feldman, who's just written a book about this subject called The Cool War. It's about how you actually target another society with viruses to switch off their economically productive population between the ages of 25 and 45 with some kind of flu virus, which you can do with plausible deniability. Anyway, that's the answer to a question I can't remember. So I have no idea whether that's the answer to your question. And on the feminist side, well, that's very interesting. Women are coming back into war for a very simple reason, and this is agency. So I don't subscribe to the idea that war is gendered, and it's what men do. The argument by scientists, some scientists, not all, is that women were in the war business from day one, but they went out of the war business with bow and arrows because they didn't have the upper body strength in order to discharge those. And then at that point, war became very gendered, and women have come back in thanks to technology, which has given them the agency to come back into war, which is why all the warriors now in Hollywood are female warriors. Hunger Games, etc., etc. They're all females They're all, in Nietzsche's sense, becoming what they are. They've all been warriors, but weren't aware of that fact until the situation required them to become so. And the argument about body strength, yes, well, that is still important, but in the age of exoskeletons and whatnot, less important. But the interesting thing is that women have higher pain thresholds than men. They have better inductive reasoning than men. It means they can deal with a fast-moving situation, stress, in other words, better than men. And it may well be, I'm not arguing this point, but you could argue the point that women are actually better suited for war than men are. And that would be a huge surprise. Now, there are many feminists who would immediately decapitate me for saying this on the grounds that war should and is a male thing. But we can talk about transgender as well. I mean, this is the big debate amongst the feminist society. If you can reconfigure the human body, if sexuality is something to do basically with choices that you can make, and you have agency in those choices, because technology for the first time has given you those choices, what does that actually mean? What does feminism mean now in the 21st century? And that's a big debate that is being conducted. I think the same debate is now going to be conducted about war as well.
Are there any female voices? Sorry, just do you have any names?
Most of the female voices are against war, and most of the people who are taught in feminist and not courses, international relations courses, feminism, will say that war is a male gendered activity. But Plato was there at the beginning when he said that women can do war as well as men. And he said it was gendered. It was just that men had decided to exclude women for one reason or another from the whole package. It's a minefield that I don't wish to get into, thank you very much, but I'm just saying that it's a debate which is opening up. It's not going to go away.
Right, there are a couple of... Right, you three. Yeah, you
I
first.
just wanted to ask what you think about the development of AI symbiosis or across different nations and cultures. And whether it's
I can't
Could you
hear,
speak
sorry.
up, please?
Oh, how do you think the development of AI or computerized war will differ across different nations, and whether the development will be similar to the historical cases? You mentioned bow and arrow, or say force archers or gunpowder, where one nation tries to catch up with another by copying, and then some other nation develops something new.
Yeah.
One of the most prominent explanations for the Fermi paradox is the great filter idea in terms of why we haven't found other intelligent life forms. And the filter idea is basically that there's a certain step or a threshold that's very difficult to cross, which may be behind this, but one of the most plausible explanations is that biological intelligent life forms destroy themselves by over-consuming their resources. So I'm wondering about sort of the optimism in your talk about the idea of us learning to coexist with this, with AI and technological development, because it could be that we actually won't give ourselves the opportunity to have technology help us out with some of these problems. The tipping points are sooner than we recognize. So I'm wondering if you've kind of thought about this in terms of AI's ability to evolve in time to avoid what could be the filter ceiling, because you seem actually surprisingly optimistic to me in terms of the possibilities for both human and technological life.
Standing up at the back. Yeah.
Do you think whether the development of AI is going to have an effect on the hierarchy in an international state, in terms of the moment you could argue that the US and China are supreme in terms of the international state? Do you think that AI is going to have a major effect on that and shake it up to the point at which you've got, say, someone like Afghanistan coming up to be a major player, simply because it's not about how big your population is, it could potentially be about how good your programs are.
Okay, AI and culture. Yes, well, basically I think it does. Can't quite see who asked me that question. Thank you. It's, yeah, I think it is basically culture. I mean, there are only two major players in the IR business, China and the United States. China may be ahead in certain respects. Quantum computing, for example, I think China probably is ahead. The Americans say that they're ahead in quantum computing in terms of commercial viability, but the Chinese say they're ahead in terms of military capability. Encryption, for example, is extremely important. And there's nobody else. And the Russians are certainly not in the business. The European Union is not in the business. So yes, I think that that may be one way in which those two powers maintain their position in international society, which goes back to Kenneth Waltz idea of the anarchical society. So it's another of those images, and it's where it plays into that. Optimism, no one has ever accused me of being optimistic before. So I am very, I believe like George Orwell and all the other isms have been discredited from liberalism to communism, pessimism would still reign supreme. And therefore I've been a pessimist all my life. It's a good position to be. Yes, complexity is what you're talking about, and Tainter's idea of Joseph Tainter of societies and civilizations collapsing because of complexity. It's interesting that he never talked about, and historians have never talked about technological complexity. They talk about social complexity. But of course, if you follow my argument or the Bruno Latour argument, social complexity is technological complexity. So there's no distinction between the two. There's a very pessimistic book by John Casti called X Events. He's a scientist from Santa Fe Institute, who explains there are 9 ways in which our society will collapse in the very soon future. He puts his money on the internet because he says there's a hole in the internet that was discovered 20 years ago and hasn't actually been plugged, and that when the internet collapses, our whole social world will collapse. He believes that we have just added to levels of technological complexity that are unsustainable. So that's a book that I would certainly recommend. I'm not sure about the aliens though. And programming, who asked me the question on programming? Programming, yes. Well, I think programming is the key to all of this, because programming requires and presupposes a programmer. Programmer has a view of how the world actually works. And a programmer introduces, consciously or unconsciously, the biases into that thinking. So the great example, of course, is a very old example, is Sim City back in the 1970s, one of the very first computer games. But I mention it because it was played by American city fathers who were trying to work out how a city should actually run and how to do city planning. Urban renewal and all that type of thing, but of course it doesn't have any place in it for ethnic tensions. And you try to take ethnic tensions out of an American city and see how that American city runs, and it's not really possible in the real world. But you can't actually program that into a computer. And that goes back to go back to a much earlier example of the Vietnam War. There's this 10-part series now taking part, which you can see on television about the Vietnam War. But one of the interesting things is that when Robert McNamara, who was the Defense Secretary at the time, was told by one of his junior staff one Monday morning, "Mr. Secretary, I don't think we can win this war." Why do you say that? Because I've been reading a history of Vietnam, and you really don't want to take on the Vietnamese. You know? The Mongols occupied Vietnam for 10 years and were driven out. I mean, the Chinese tried to do this and were driven out. Nobody takes on the Mongols. Nobody takes on the Vietnamese. To which he famously replied, "Son, don't give me your poetry. Give me the statistics. Because we can't program military history into a computer. But we can program statistics into a computer." And I still think we're there to this day. When we're engaging with other societies, we can't program the military history. In a sense, this is the big battle between qualitative and quantitative. And the qualitative, I think, always wins out at the end of the day. I'm glad that I have one supporter in the audience here. Thank you. Right, let's exchange emails.
The final few questions over in that corner. Sorry, are you the only? Okay, you two. Yeah, you and you. You go first.
Yeah, so if robots were to come into combat, they would have to value the human life in the field. Do Do you think that humans will ever be willing to give that right over to a machine to value a human life, especially in the case, for example, a child soldier? And if we did, how would we confirm that they would value them on the same morals as we have and not on the ones that they would develop through their own sentiency?
Right, final question.
You mentioned at the end of your talk that one of the more optimistic scenarios for robots and artificial intelligence is that they could decide that war was not what they wanted to do and take humans out of war. Do you think that it's only through artificial intelligence and robots that that can ever be achieved? Because earlier in the talk, you mentioned how we shouldn't confuse origins with mechanisms, and technology is a mechanism for war. Its origins were more human. Does that mean that the ending of war, if that's even possible, would have to be human as well?
Yes. Well, the origins of war are entirely technical, not technological, because we don't have the teeth and we don't have the talons to tear people apart. So we can't actually kill people without weapons. That's the way we do it. It can be a crude stone, it can be a spear, which were the first weapons we devised. It can be a bow and arrow later on. It can be chemical power rather than mechanical power, so it can be gunpowder. But basically, the only way we could kill each other was through weapons. That is not true of many other animal species. So, are we the only people who can bring war to an end? Yes, I think we are. But it comes down to the stories you want to tell, because everything at the end of the day is storytelling. So you can be very Hegelian about this. You know, Hegel said that war, he was very teleological. Kant was very teleological. Kant said essentially that war would end when we no longer needed it to introduce each other to one another. So basically, war had been the way in which we discovered the stranger and the other. And after killing the other, we then sat down and did peace treaties, and then we traded, and then we realized that the other wasn't such a bad person after all. And then basically, as we went around the world, the whole world had become the other, that instead of killing, we would talk to. It's called asocial sociability. So sociability begins in asociability, a hatred of the other, and ends up in a love of the other. Well, not love perhaps, but anyway. That's a great story you can tell yourself, but unfortunately cyberspace has totally destroyed that story. Because cyberspace was so supposed to start. I remember those stories, because you're too young to know that. But I remember when cyberspace began, we were told that cyberspace was going to destroy nationality, it was going to destroy any tribal affiliations you might have. We'd all live in this wonderful space. I'd be talking to somebody 12,000 miles away, who would be my friend. Cyberspace produces tribalism. It amplifies tribalism. It produces chat rooms of people, like-minded people who don't want to associate it with non-like. It's even more iniquitous than the physical world. I think it's very, very dangerous indeed. And when we talk to the air in 1903, which was the third domain of war that nobody had done before, except for hot air balloons in the 19th century, the air didn't make us more murderous. It just enabled us to continue our murderousness. Cyberspace makes us more murderous, I think. It induces paranoia. It induces tribalism and all the other things. It's an extremely dangerous domain indeed. And all those people who said that nationality would be like wearing a football shirt. You know, you wear a football shirt on a Saturday. When you go to the game on a Monday, you're wearing something else when you go to work. That hasn't actually happened. So, anyway, sorry, that was the kind of party thing. Now, your question on, which was about the Google car, yes. Well, the Google car, of course, kills a few people because it has to make a decision. Do I kill the child, or do I kill 3 people who are over there? What decision am I going to make? That's something that they're working on. We don't know what that will be. The big question about robots at the moment, and the reason why the Stop the Killer campaign, Killer Robot campaign is about human control. It's removing human control. But then, of course, you can also argue that there is no human control in war very much, that we are the product of our Stone Age 300,000-year-old minds in terms of cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias, and premature cognitive closure, and all the things that were there 300,000 years ago, which social psychologists tell us are so bad and which we have not yet escaped, which the robots will apparently not be party to. We can also talk about human control in terms of emotional reactions, the inability to control our passions when we see our friends killed, the bloodlust that follows. So roboticists say, what is this human control that the International Red Cross is talking about? There's never been human control. We tried to control it, but let's not fool ourselves that human beings are not in control of their emotions and their psychological reactions, and that robots may be fully in control. I can see the reverse argument here, of course, but I'm just putting it, and the roboticists say that's the moral upgrade, that we will escape our Stone Age brains, and that we've escaped everything else from the Stone Age in terms of the weapons we use and our agency and the computers and everything else. And now we have a moral escape from the moral hole that we've been in for 300,000 years. And I think that's an argument that should really be addressed before you dismiss it out of hand. And I can see why you might want, not you personally, you might want to dismiss it. And the other thing is human dignity, which is there in the Martins Clause as a protocol, 1977, of the Geneva Conventions, that you must kill a person with human dignity. You know what that actually means? That a human being should kill a human being. And you shouldn't allow a non-human being to kill a human being. But this, for me, is a great cop-out. We have been only killing each other for about 25,000 years. Before that, we were the prey. We were killed by animals. We were stalked by animals. They had the advantage. We didn't have the weapons that enabled our pathetic bodies to amplify with our brains the chance to actually get the upper hand. So the idea, this is not my argument, by the way, it's an argument by Barbara Ehrenreich in her book Blood Rights. The reason we're horrified that robots will be killing us is that for the first time in 25,000 years, non-human beings will be killing other human beings, and that's what we find is an insult to human dignity.
We could end up as prey.
That we could end up as prey. Is that a good argument? So let's at least, and I can see that there are good arguments against it, so let's engage these arguments in that kind of open-minded way, rather than just revert back to the fact that being killed by an autonomous drone 30,000 feet up, well, less than 5,000 feet up, that decides to kill me is any more undignified than an Apache helicopter appearing behind a hill and vaporizing me, as this is what they do, they vaporize you, so nothing is actually left. What's the difference? Of course, I can look the Apache helicopter pilot in the eye, I suppose, if I'm lucky enough to live that long enough, and say, I've been killed by a fellow warrior in a helicopter. But what's the difference in being killed 7,000 miles away from a guy in Nevada who I can't look in the eye? I don't know. But the argument is, does that actually matter or not? That's the question. And it gets back, and have I got 2 minutes? It gets back the ultimate Thucydidean question, which I think is a very interesting one. Thucydides has a passage in his histories where an Athenian guard says to a Spartan who has been captured the day before in an engagement, it's not a battle, but it's just a small engagement, were your friends who killed yesterday, were they brave men or were they cowards? And the Spartan replies, famously, well, it would be an extraordinary weapon, wouldn't it, that could actually tell the difference between a brave man and a coward. And as I tell my students, of course, if the Greeks could have invented a weapon that could tell the difference between a brave man and a coward, we know what that weapon would have been programmed to kill: the cowards, and to allow the brave man to continue the fight. Today, we would program it to kill the brave men and keep the cowards alive, basically, i.e. the civilians, etc. So it's a social construction at the end of the day, basically, who you decide should live and who should die. It's a choice That's where your responsibility comes from. That's where human responsibility comes from, the right that you have to choose. And where does choice come? In the end, it comes from technology. It comes from tools. That you have tools that allow you to make choices. If you didn't have those tools, you couldn't make the choices. There would be no ethics, essentially. So we're all in the middle of a very, very, very important debate as to the right and wrong and the ethics of all of this. And it's an interesting, keep tuned to the channel and see what's actually going to happen at the end of the day. But we have to keep our minds a little bit more open than we actually do. And that's slightly in favor of the roboticists. But I also accept the roboticists are over in love with technology, and technology goes completely wrong, as we know, in so many cases. Sorry.
Finish on
finished.
point. Chris has raised many, many questions, and he's opened up many, many issues. If you want to consider some of these things at your leisure, the lecture is being vidcast and will be on the departmental website, so you can go back to something that you might not have understood. An extended version of the lecture will be published in the journal International Relations in March. And if you'd like something more immediately, Chris is developing tomorrow morning at 9:30 in G3 Llandinam building, is developing one of the questions that he raised during the talk, that is, does war still need us? I promised you something broad and deep, and I think Chris has delivered. So can you please join me in giving him 5 minutes?